Thank you. I'm so grateful we can be in touch via Zoom. So many of us are sheltering apart from each other. Some of us are fortunate to be sheltering with our Dharma communities or family. And some of us are out in the streets. So it's a very unusual time. I'm also so grateful for you, Paya, and our residents, and our board of directors, and Noah, and Kozan, and Wendy. And I'm grateful to my teachers, particularly Roshi Bernie Glassman. These days, I'm thinking a lot about beloved community. It's a time, I think that beloved community is really important for us. We maybe have taken for granted the connections, the relationships that we have in our ordinary lives, and yet all of a sudden we're really cherishing the opportunity for some kind of intimacy over this media, whether it's YouTube or Zoom or Skype or whatever. And we're in quite a time of turmoil and of great uncertainty. I mean, today I read that we passed the marker of 150,000 deaths from this virus. And there are probably many more than that that aren't recorded. So it's a very strange and deeply disturbing time of radical uncertainty, and also a time for what John Lewis has called good trouble. So I think, as Noah mentioned, my 78th birthday is tomorrow. I usually give a talk around this time. I'm somewhat surprised that I lived so long. And I'm also grateful that I have managed to make it to at least the 78th year. Tomorrow at 7 or 7:30 in the morning is my so-called date of emergence. But to be honest, since the last presidential election, I've been feeling at times a lot of dismay. And I think that dismay is shared by many of us. And I've also felt like my work has been cut out for me. You know, I was born during a terrible war that was to eradicate fascism. So it's very disturbing, since this conversation was in my own family for years about the profound dangers of fascism, dangers reflected in the camps, dangers reflected in a kind of militaristic view. And that view also was reflected in my family in relation to what happened in 1945, which was the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And we know that somewhere around 250,000 men, women, and children died from these bombs, many on the day the bombs were dropped and many thereafter. And the deployment of weapons of mass destruction on that 6th of August and the 9th of August on Hiroshima and Nagasaki really ushered in a new era when the human hunger for violence can now destroy the entire human race and make the earth, this whole earth basically uninhabitable for all but the most resilient of species. And it's 75 years since that horrifying event. And I think that the urgency of the Second World War got into the psyche of many of my generation. You know, we wanted to end violence in the world, direct and indirect violence, as well as structural violence. And that commitment that we have been subject to lives with us today, and I believe that it is shared by many. Probably all of us who are together at this moment share this sense of a profound imperative to end violence, to end the military-industrial complex in our world. Yesterday, I gave a talk to the Ambedkarite Buddhists in India, and I recounted the story of a great hero of mine. His name is A.J. Muste. And during the war in Vietnam, this man of faith and this political activist, someone who worked in the labor movement, the pacifist movement, the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, he would stand in front of the White House night after night with a single candle. And many nights he was alone. And one night, a reporter interviewed him as he stood in the rain. And the reporter said to him, "Mr. Muste, do you really think you're going to change the policies of this country by standing out here alone at night with a candle?" And Muste said, "Oh, I don't do this to change the country. I do this so the country won't change me." You know, in my book, Standing at the Edge, I write, how is it that some people don't get beaten down by the world, but are animated by the deep desire to serve? Muste was such a person. So was Roshi Burney. So is Joanna Macy. So is Malala. So is Greta Thunberg. And so was the Buddha. I mean, the Buddha said, "I teach one thing, and one thing only, the truth of suffering and freedom from suffering." And he didn't skip the first part, the truth of suffering. The Buddha also said, "My Dharma is swimming upstream." We're swimming upstream pretty hard now against a strong tide. The pandemic, thinking about Portland, climate catastrophe, racist violence, political corruption, and more. It takes a lot of virya. It takes a lot of wholeheartedness to swim against the tides of violence we are experiencing today. And please know, Zen practice is precisely this: swimming against the tide, swimming upstream, and being wholehearted and resilient, and not denying the truth and presence of suffering and impermanence, as well as realizing that liberation is possible by realizing fundamental unselfishness. You know, this practice of Zen is also grounded in the experience that bodhisattvas do not seek easy situations. I know some people say, "I want to get out of this country." There are times I'm ready to move to New Zealand. But listen, this is our charnel ground. Bodhisattvas practice and serve in charnel grounds, whether we're working as a healthcare provider, whether we ourselves are dealing with sickness or with loss or with grief, whether we're protesting in Portland or in DC, whether we're calling out corrupt politicians in Congress or sheltering at home, which can also be a charnel ground. So I titled the talk today, Nothing is Hidden. By this phrase, which Zen Master Dogen repeats a number of times in the Shobo Genzo, what Dogen means and what I mean is that the truth is right in front of us, the truth of suffering and freedom from suffering. And the path is also right under our feet, if we can but see it, if we can but feel it. Truth, which shares the same root as the word for Dharma, means not seeing part of the truth or half of the truth. It means really having the capacity to see the whole truth. Both the granularity of particularities and the truth of interconnectedness, and also the truth of impermanence. Can we see it? Can we see it through the medium of our own experience? Can we see it in the context of our lives, including how it's reflected in our social institutions? I remember being in Bodh Gaya many years ago during an international network of engaged Buddhist meeting, and sitting next to Sulak Shivaraksha, who pounded his cane on the hard earth as he barked, "We have to see the truth." Sulak is my hero. I have many heroes and heroines. Sulak always has had the courage to speak truth to power and face profound imprisonment. Sulak initiated so many different social, humanitarian, ecological, and spiritual movements and organizations in Thailand. And he's also one of the founders of INEB, the International Network of Engaged Buddhists. And I remember years ago, during an INEB meeting in Thailand this time, that I was so fortunate to attend, Sulak pointed out that the heart of socially engaged Buddhism, which he saw as essential Buddhism, as the core, the very marrow of Buddhism, is our capacity to respond to violence, and particularly structural violence. He made it clear how the roots of our suffering, that is greed, hatred, and delusion, are manifested not just in individual views, values, attitudes, and actions, but also in how our very social institutions are structured and how they operate. Now, Sulak's solution to violence has long been to instantiate in our social institutions a really powerful ethic of care, an ethic of courage, and an ethic of compassion. He often would reflect to us the importance of the emphasis on the precepts in Buddhism, and as such, what it is to be awake now, to be a Buddha now, what it is to live non-violently. Basically, to have an ethic of care means that we practice in order to cultivate a kind of stability that allows us to perceive reality, the whole of reality, clearly, including the truth of suffering and the path transforming suffering. At an early INEB meeting, I met a remarkable woman. Her name was Samaneri Dhammananda. She later became Bhikshuni Dhammananda, the first ordained woman in Thailand. And her work as a Thai feminist and revolutionary brought her into the experience of ordination in order that women could enter the Sangha as equals. And so her community is composed of many female monastics, again, seeking gender parity in a world where violence toward women is so present. This is an ethic of care and an ethic of courage. And this feels so important at this time of finding ourselves in the charnel grounds of structural and direct violence, in the charnel grounds of political corruption, in the charnel ground of our climate catastrophe, in the charnel ground of racism, and in the charnel ground of this pandemic that is sweeping the globe. I think it's so important that we see deeply not only what is happening right now, but also see what the roots of violence are in ourselves and in our social institutions. Now, for those of us who have a relationship with socially engaged Buddhism, we've been very influenced by the work of Johan Galtung, a pioneer in the field of peace studies. And Galtung makes the point that we have a somewhat narrow view of violence as the direct and intentional infliction of physical harm on human beings. And Galtung and others proposed a much wider and deeper understanding of violence as that which violates basic human needs and rights. And I would expand this perspective on violence to include violence toward our earth. Galtung defines direct violence as the deliberate attempt to cause injury to a person's physical and psychological integrity through brutal treatment, through rape, through homicide, through imprisonment, through forced labor, and more. And as I just mentioned, I would suggest that the definition needs to expand to include violence toward the earth through, for example, the extraction industries, including the petrochemical industry, tanneries, industrial dump sites, gold mining, and also in relation to hunting, to animal farm factories, and even the fashion industry. And Galtung makes the important point, however, that direct violence and structural violence are interdependent, including family violence, gender violence, hate crimes, racial violence. Importantly for us today, police violence, terrorism, and war. And I would also include rape of this earth. Galtung defines structural violence as a form of violence where social structures or social institutions harm people, and I add, and other species, and Earth herself, through power imbalances that prevent people from meeting their basic needs. And of course, we know this as social injustice. And I would include here environmental injustice. Also understand that part of structural violence is what is called cultural violence, which includes racism, sexism, homophobia, and any devaluation of particular groups or culture. And I would contend that the Buddha saw suffering as violence. Violence toward ourselves as well as others, and violence arising from greed, from hatred, from delusion. The Buddha, we know historically, was concerned not only with the violence that we do to ourselves in not waking up, not seeing what is happening inside of our narrow subjectivity, but he was also concerned with structural violence. And this is reflected in his response in relation to those of the lowest caste, for example, in India at that time, and also toward women. We today are in the midst of profound social and environmental issues related to structural violence. One of the areas that is most disturbing is in relation to the economic structures that are degrading life for millions of people, and also taking life away from species of every kind. I believe that our Zen practice needs to be directed toward waking up to violence. Violence within ourselves and violence in the world. We need to see and acknowledge the truth of suffering. We need to acknowledge what is going on in the world right now. We cannot bypass. We have to see what is happening in our country, and also how our mind is responding, how our heart is responding. And we must not cover up the suffering, cover it up with the syrup of emptiness, or be caught in the trance of moral apathy. Truly, and this I learned from Glassman Roshi, we have to bear witness to it, not reject it. And we have to develop an appropriate relationship to suffering. Others, the suffering that institutions of power promulgate, and the suffering of others. I'm also reminded of some words from Zen Master Dogen. He said, just as parents care for their children, you should bear in mind the whole universe. This is our practice. Zen is being fully with things just as they are, not turning away from anything. Zen is also being thorough in all things in our day-to-day life. Dogen says, protect the ingredients of life as if they were your own eyeballs. Zen is also being what we are doing. precisely, simply, in the inclusive field of awareness as each moment unfolds, no matter how fraught that moment is. Zen, I feel, is seeing deeply. In other words, nothing is hidden. Dogen said, the whole world is not hidden. Can we see it? And how do we see it? So Suzuki Roshi asked his students to always direct themselves fully to the immediate situation. He said that Zen practice is an arrow pointing to this very moment mind, with the truth of suffering, the truth of joy, as it is, with apathy, defeat, dismay, futility, with play and pleasure, all of it just as it is, being with all of life as it is. So last week we had the wonderful opportunity, many of us, to sit in the Genjo Koan session. And again, Kozan and Kigaku and I kept turning toward, this is it, Genjo Koan. This is Dharma, this is being right here. The whole catastrophe, the whole of awakening in this very moment, whatever is given to us. So this morning, I woke up way early and wasn't quite, awake. And I went to the door to open it a little, and I somehow stubbed my foot and my toe, and I think I broke my toe. And I thought, oh, okay, this is what's given. I had to laugh. I said, this very moment, this pain, this discomfort, this awkwardness. And then Wendy came to visit me this morning, and we taped it up. And I had hoped to hike with the residents tomorrow. I don't know if I'll be able to do that, but in any case, I was showing her how I was going to try to walk as if I hadn't done something stupid at 4 a.m. in the morning. No, nothing is hidden. Now everybody knows. My limp is authentic. So in this practice, we are asked to meet each situation with a kind of sense of self-discipline, but also with courage and trust. And I will say, for the most part, what I learned from Bernie is also having a good sense of humor. Even after his stroke, even in the middle of his cancer, everything that he talked about had this kind of glaze of humor on it. And this kind of open, unbiased, unfiltered awareness. So how do we do this? How do we do this as we serve others? And this is really important because we're at a time when it's not just about survival of one, survival of the single individual. We are coming into this deep lived experience of interbeing, of interconnectedness, of connection, of realizing that one careless person who is sick can cause the death of many. One uncaring person, one person without care. So Suzuki Roshi taught that our intention means that we're being really serious about our lives, about not squandering our life, not squandering our practice, and not squandering the lives of others. So Suzuki Roshi really put gravity into the middle of his Dharma. And so did Roshi Bernie, sitting in Auschwitz with him on the selection site, feeling the gravity of what fascism wrought, and realizing we've got to be really serious about our practice so this never happens again. And yet, look what's happening in our country. And those of you who were with us for the Dogen session, remember what I said. Dogen admonishes us in Hotsu Bodaishin, bringing others to the other shore before ourselves. And I recall what Norman Fisher wrote in a book on Dogen's teachings that Kaz translated. And he said, enlightenment is basically being completely unselfish. So the taste of Zen is this openness. Nothing has to be hidden from us. There's nothing to resist. There's nothing to hide from. And as Hongzhi said, not one single atom opposes us. Not one single atom opposes us, even in the most difficult of situations. And I remember having a conversation with Jonas Salk, and he said, he was an elder at this time, probably about my age. And he said, I've just had to learn how to cooperate with the inevitable. Cooperate with the inevitable. But the inevitable doesn't mean passivity. He developed the vaccine. He did a lot of good in the world. Thich Nhat Hanh said that he was a lazy monk. And how many books did he write? It's because he didn't resist what needed to happen. And I feel in part what needs to happen at this time is that we actively cultivate, that we actively work for and grow a civil society, a beloved community, a compassionate society, a community of all beings. Some time ago, I was reading my colleague Ira Bach's really wonderful book on being with dying. His book is called The Best Care Possible. And he put into the book a little anecdote about Margaret Mead. And it goes like this. Years ago, anthropologist Margaret Mead was asked by a student what she considered the first sign of civilization in a culture. The student expected Mead to talk about fish hooks or clay pots or grinding stones. But no. Mead said that the first sign of civilization in an ancient culture was a femur, a thigh bone, that had been broken, then healed. Mead explained that in the animal kingdom, if you break your leg, you die. You cannot run from danger, get to the river for a drink or hunt food. You are meat for prowling beasts. No animal survives a broken leg long enough for the bone to heal. A broken femur that is healed is proof that someone has taken time to stay with the person who has fell, has bound up the wound, has carried the person to safety, and has tended the person through recovery. Helping someone through difficulty is where civilization starts, said Mead. We are at our best when we serve others. Be civilized. I'm seeing civilization unfold in so many quarters. Yes, the femur is broken, badly broken. And also, yes, there is more and more evidence that we are at our best when we serve others. Dogen was right. Suzuki Roshi was right. Bernie was right. Malala was right. Joanna Macy is right. Finishing this talk, I say, may we be brave and not turn away either from the truth of suffering or freedom from suffering. May we realize that being socially engaged and dedicated to ending structural and direct violence in our world today is the only sane and loving path before us. May we come to see that nothing is hidden if we open our eyes and our heart. So finishing this talk with words from Shantideva in the great text, The Bodhisattva's Way of Life. For as long as space remains, and as long as beings remain, may I too remain to end suffering in this world. So thank you for being with me for this short talk, and also for your kindness and support of Upaya as we find our way through to being a beloved community of service and practice.